Okay, Shabbat Shalom and welcome. Thank you for joining me today and for being part of our ongoing study on Torah. Generally, the title is generally Torah. And over the course of our present study, we are in class number 10. I have presented some material up to this point which challenges, if you will, some fundamentalist views, primarily or particularly when it comes to the idea of authorship. Who wrote these documents that we look to as sacred literature? So when it comes to authorship, I know that I've presented some material up to this point which is somewhat challenging. But I want to say that when I do that, I'm telling you things that, even though it might challenge fundamentalist views, it does not challenge what the Scriptures themselves say, because the Scriptures don't claim that Moses wrote the first 5 books. Now, having said that, my research has led me to believe, and I've sought to show over the last several weeks, that based upon a careful reading of these texts, that Moses did in fact write a scroll, that Moses himself wrote a scroll, and that we know this scroll by several names in Scripture because it's referenced in the third person. We read about this scroll of the Torah. We read about the scroll of Moses. We read about a document called the TORAH of Moses, or the instruction of Moses. In previous classes, I have sought to bring forth evidence in the previous 9 classes that demonstrates that within the book of Deuteronomy, within the 5th book of that document that we refer to as the Torah, is contained the contents of the Moses scroll. In other words, if you look at the book of Deuteronomy contains within it this ancient document that was written by Moses himself. Now, I want to make a point very, very clear at this point, because what I don't want to happen is for people to, as we say, throw out the baby with the bathwater. In other words, some people might begin to think Ross talks about Deuteronomy all the time, as if Deuteronomy is the only significant document in the 5 books, in the first 5 books. And that is not the case. That is not what I am saying, and it's not what I intend to put across. So I want to make this very clear. I want people to understand me that because we've been focusing thus far on the book of Deuteronomy, just because of that, and I've been doing that for a very particular reason, it does not mean that I do not accept the authenticity of the other books, okay? So I want people to understand that I love these books, that I work in these books, and I want people to understand that as this study goes forth, we will be dealing with the material, with the stories, with the content of Genesis, of Exodus, of Leviticus, of Numbers, and of Deuteronomy, not just Deuteronomy. There's a very particular reason why I've dealt with Deuteronomy first. I hope by the end of today's class that will be clear, because I'm dealing with today the idea that Deuteronomy is different. That Deuteronomy is different than the other 4. So this will become very evident as we continue to work through our study on the Torah. So what I'm telling you is that today's class does not wrap up the series on the Torah, but it will put us in a very good place to move forward into the rest of the 5 books. So again, within the accounts that are recorded for us in the book of Genesis, in the book of Exodus, in the book of Leviticus, and in the book of Numbers, I find great relevance. I find true history, or what I would call sacred history, and I get immense value from reading these other documents. So people are probably listening thinking, wow, you took 10 classes to say that. I wanted to develop a certain key point initially, and that is that within the book of Deuteronomy is contained this first-person account written by Moses himself. Now, today I'm going to take us in a little bit different path, still working on the same subject material, but I'm going to surprise you today because I'm working primarily from other texts, at least initially, to bring about sort of an introduction to class number 10. And I want to begin by telling you that one of my loves, one of my passions in biblical studies is a study of what I would call the wilderness itineraries. And the wilderness itineraries is the subject field which deals with the children of Israel from the time they leave the Nile Delta, from the land of Goshen, through their travels through the wilderness, and then into the land of Israel. It's one of my favorite studies. Part of that reason is because it is so fundamental, it's so foundational. And along the way of that study, you come across 42 stops, 42 stations along the way, from the time they leave until the time they cross in. One of those stations is Sinai or Horeb. So one of the things that I enjoy most, and you can, if you come visit me, you'll see that I have an entire bookshelf full of books related to the wilderness itineraries, the wilderness travels. I love the wilderness. I love to read about it, love to study about it, and I love to go to the wilderness. Many of you know that I spend a good deal of time in the wildernesses. And part of the reason is because I'm taking these ancient texts and I'm looking at my surroundings and I'm validating or verifying these ancient texts. We're talking about this is the location, here's a description of it, and this is evidence that this is accurate, if you will. So we talk about the wilderness. We learn a lot about the wilderness from midway through the book of Exodus all the way through the rest of the 5 books. And so one of the things that I want to talk about today is evidence from the book of Numbers. Now in Hebrew, the book of Numbers is called Bamidbar, in the wilderness. In the wilderness. So for today's class, I want to begin my teaching in this book, and the reason will become clear as I work through the material today. Because what I'm going to do is use some of the material in the book of Bamidbar, in the wilderness, in the book of Numbers, to lead up to what I want to share with you today. So if you are ready, this is where we're going to begin. Again, evidence provided by the book of Bamidbar, by the book of Numbers, helps us to identify key stops along the way. It places these stops along a time-based continuum in the wilderness journeys of the children of Israel. A careful study of these texts provides what I would call proof of certain popular theories, but it also provides evidence which disproves certain popular theories. Now, I want to go this morning to the book of Numbers chapter 20. Now, I'm just going to roll through and highlight some points as we work our way through the final chapters of the book of Numbers, and you will see why this is important to our present study on Torah. Now, in the book of Numbers, in chapter 20, by the time we reach chapter 20, it says in verse 1, Numbers 20, verse 1, "Then came the children of Israel, the whole congregation, into the desert of Sin in the first month. And the people abode at Kadesh, and Miriam died there and was buried there. And then it goes on to talk about the conditions. There was no water for the congregation and so forth. What I want to stress is that at this point in the journey, the children of Israel are clearly indicated as being in the wilderness of sin. Now, you can look at most biblical maps, and this is not disputed. Like most solid, reputable biblical maps are not going to put the desert of sin, T-Z-I-N. There's also a desert of sin, as we say, S-I-N. Doesn't have anything to do with the concept of misbehavior. But the name sin is to be distinguished from the desert of sin. So here we have the children of Israel at this point are in the wilderness of sin. We know where the wilderness of sin is. It is west of the Jordan. Okay, if you're looking at a biblical map, east of the Jordan is going to put you in the land of Moab, the land of Edom, in the various tribes that are over in that region. We are west when we're in the wilderness of sin. A couple of things happen here. Miriam and Aaron both die in this wilderness. Remember, the wilderness of sin is west of the Jordan. Many traditionalists place the burial, the location of Mount Hor, which is described as the place where where Aaron dies, they place that east of the Jordan. In fact, if you take a tour of the land of Jordan today, they will take you to a traditional site where Aaron died and was buried, Mount Hor. It's the wrong site, okay? The correct site has to be on the west side. You might think, what's he going through all this for? Bear with me. So now, one of the points that I want to bring up is that Deuteronomy and the book of Numbers, as well as the book of Exodus and Leviticus, provide different details. Sometimes these details don't line up. So, for instance, in the Torah, in the first 4 books, actually in the book of Numbers particularly, we learn that Aaron dies at Mount Hor and he's buried there. In Deuteronomy, you can hold your hand here and go to Deuteronomy chapter 10, just to show you one point along the way. Deuteronomy 10 and verse 6 says, "And the children of Israel took their journey from Be'erot Bani Yaakan to Moserah. There Aaron died, and there he was buried." So the book of Deuteronomy records a different location for the death and burial of Aaron. Now, some can explain this. In other words, we might say, well, perhaps Moser was the area in which Mount Hor was, and that could very well be the case. But you see, it's different details. I call these data points. We need these data points to figure out what's actually going on there. Now, if you look at chapter 21 of Numbers, in chapter 21, we get an interesting point. Now, the children of Israel, by the way, are still in the wilderness of sin. And we get this account, chapter 21, verse 1. "And when the Canaanite, the king of Arad, who dwelt in the Negev, heard tell that Israel came by way of the Atarim, then he fought against Israel and took some of them prisoners," and so forth. We know where Arad is. I've been there. The Coles have been there. The Tylers have been there. We all went together. I took a tour group there with Jono Vandor and Tovia Singer. The kingdom of Arad is certain in terms of archaeological evidence. There's evidence of a Canaanite presence there. I mean, this goes back into the Bronze Age. And then of later periods of dwelling in this region. So we know where this place is. All right? So here we have a data point which tells where the children of Israel are. The king of Arad gives us one clue. We find out that they have to turn to avoid going through Edom. Now, Edom would be basically an easterly trip to go through the area, but they're not allowed to pass. So they have to go around. Now, in chapter 21, we also find out, remember the story where the children of Israel rebelled against Moses and against God, and serpents bit the children of Israel? That story tells us a little bit more about the geography. What does Moses do? He's told to make a bronze serpent, a nechosh nechashet, and he's to place it on a pole, and anyone who looks at that that's been bitten will live. It just so happens, just to place us geographically in the right place, that directly in this area, to this day, we have evidence of the ancient world's largest copper mining and smelting places. So they would have retrieved the copper from this place. We've been there as well. We've been on this site, and you can actually see the copper and some slag where it's been heated in this area. And it talks about an area named Ovot. All of this is right there in the same region. Now, I'm building up to something. When you get to chapter 22, the children of Israel are now at this point encamped in what the English calls the plains of Moab. In Hebrew, it's the Aravot, the plains of the Moab. And you'll recall the story that Balak, the king of Moab, hires a soothsayer from the east by the name of Bilam. In English, we call him Balaam. Remember Balaam and the donkey. So he hires Balaam to curse the children of Israel at this location. Now, if you'll recall, Deuteronomy begins with the children of Israel in this region. All right, they're already in the plains of Moab is the setting that we're introduced to as the book of Deuteronomy begins. Now, one point just to tell you that in Numbers chapter 22 through 24, we get the story of Balaam. And we get one account in Numbers 31 about the death of Balaam. But for the most part, the story, the book of Balaam as it's called, is Numbers chapter 22 through 24. Now, for those of you who study Jewish literature, you may be interested to know that in the Talmud, there is a section called Baba Batra. In 14 and 15, these sections deal with authorship. Who wrote what? In Baba Batra, it says that Moses wrote two things. He wrote his scroll, and it says he also wrote the book of Balaam. That's interesting. It's almost as if the suggestion, because we would say, well, if the book of Balaam is Numbers chapter 22 through 24, and traditionally the idea is that Moses wrote the 5 books, then why would it single that out? So there's some interesting things in Numbers chapter 22 through 24, but that's for another class. Going to keep going. Numbers chapter 25 tells us about the last stop east of the Jordan before the children of Israel cross into the land. Numbers chapter 25. We find out that the place is called Shittim. Shittim. I'm going to flip to Micah 6. You can go there if you would like, or you can stay in the book of Numbers and I'll read it for you. But in the book of Micah, chapter 6 and verse 5, it says, O my people, Remember now what Balak, the king of Moab, devised, and what Balaam, the son of Beor, answered him, from Shittim to Gilgal, that you may know the righteous acts of Jehovah. So this particular text indicates an interesting geographical reference. It tells us that from Shittim, which is the last point the children of Israel assembled east of the Jordan, and then Gilgal is the first stop on the west side. So it just covers this last transitional piece of the journey. Now, I want to go back to the book of Numbers, and I'd like you to look with me at chapter 26, Numbers 26, and verse 63. Numbers 26, verse 63. These are they that were numbered by Moses and Eleazar, the priest, who numbered the children of Israel in the plains of Moab by the Jordan near Jericho. But among these there was not a man of them whom Moses and Aaron the priest numbered when they numbered the children of Israel in the wilderness of Sinai. For the Lord had said of them, they shall surely die in the wilderness, and there was not left a man of them, except Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, and Yehoshua, or Joshua, the son of Nun. So what this tells us is that at this point in the book of Numbers, the wilderness generation, if you will, the Exodus generation is dead. We're not to the book of Deuteronomy yet, but I want you to understand that that entire generation, because of their rebellion, is dead according to what God had said. Now look down at Numbers 27 and verse 12. This is Numbers 27, verse 12. And Jehovah said to Moses, go up into this Mount Avarim and see the land which I have given to the children of Israel. And when you have seen it, you shall surely be gathered to your people as Aaron your brother was gathered, because you rebelled against my commandment in the wilderness of Sin, in the strife of the congregation, to sanctify me at the waters before their eyes. That is the water of Meribah Kadesh in the wilderness of Sin. We get all sorts of data points here, but the point that I want to really stress is that Moses is told he can't enter. He's told, you're not going to enter the land. You're going to climb up, view the land that I promised, and then you're going to die, just like Aaron died. Now notice what follows, verse 15. And Moses spoke to Jehovah, saying, let Jehovah, the God of all the spirits of all flesh, set a man over the congregation who may go out before them and who may go in before them and who may lead them out and may bring them in, so that the congregation of Jehovah shall not be as sheep that have no shepherd. And Jehovah said unto Moses, take thee Joshua the son of Nun, a man in whom is spirit, and lay your hand upon him, and set him before Eleazar the priest and before all the congregation, and give him a charge. Now what he does then is, at this point, Moses is told, you're going to go up, view the land, you're going to die. You're going to transfer the authority to Joshua before that, and you're going to recognize that Eleazar is the priest. By the way, these are the last recorded words of Moses to Jehovah in the 5 books. And Deuteronomy, there are counts of discussion, but in terms of time, this is the last thing. And it's interesting that Moses' last request is that God would appoint someone over the children of Israel to lead them and so forth. So here we go. I'm going to rapidly give you a highlight of the next few chapters. Chapter 28 and 29 of the book of Bamidbar, the book of Numbers, deals with sacrifices. Okay? Chapter 30 deals with vows. 31 deals with the war on Midian because of the crimes that were committed at Baal Peor. It also includes in 31 the death of Bilam. In chapter 32, there is an account where Gad and Reuben and half the tribe of Manasseh choose to stay on the east side of the Jordan, but they make an arrangement with Moses that you can do that, but you have to help your other brothers, the other tribes, secure their possession. Then you can go back. Remember that? Chapter 33 is a record of the wilderness stops, the travel itinerary. Chapter 34 deals with boundaries and land allotments for the tribes. When you go into the land, here's going to be the possession, here's the boundaries and so forth. 35 deals with Levitical towns and cities of refuge. 36 deals with inheritance issues. And it's sort of tied in with chapter 27 and the daughters of Zelophehad. It ends this way. Go with me to chapter 36 and verse 13, and hopefully this will help explain why I went through all of this. Because people are probably like, wow, my eyes are glossing over. Chapter 36 and verse 13. These are the commandments and the judgments, or in Hebrew, these are the mitzvot and the mishpatim, which Jehovah commanded by the hand of Moses to the children of Israel in the plains of Moab, near by Jordan, near Jericho. So it seems to wrap things up nicely. So why go through this? Because it shows that by the time we get to the end of the book of Numbers, here's what we have. Miriam and Aaron are dead. The entire wilderness generation is also dead. In other words, everything that was predicted that would come to pass has happened. The children of Israel, by the end of the book of Numbers, are on the edge of the land of promise. The kings of the east have already been defeated. The kings east of the Jordan have already been defeated. And they are poised to take possession of the land, and they've been given the allotments according to the land. Furthermore, Moses knows that he won't cross, and we've been told that he's going to die. Okay? It's already been announced. It was announced in chapter 27 of the book of Numbers, and Joshua, the replacement, the successor, is already in place. Now, consider this. If you go to Joshua chapter 1, and notice how it begins. Joshua is written in the third person. Now, after the death of Moses, the servant of Jehovah, it came to pass that Jehovah spoke to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' minister, saying, Moses, my servant, is dead. So what was predicted towards the end of the book of Numbers is that Moses would die. When you get to Joshua, Moses is dead. It flows perfectly as if it goes together. If you look at Joshua chapter 1, verse 12, the Reubenites, the Gadites, and half the tribe of Manasseh, Joshua spoke. Remember when Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you, saying, the Lord gives you rest, He'll give you this land. Your wives and your family and all your flocks will stay here. You'll go over and fight. So it's proposing in Joshua 1 that which Numbers 32 had predicted is being fulfilled right here. There's a perfect narrative flow, and it seems to be lacking nothing. Numbers predicts the death of Moses. Joshua picks up with the death of Moses. It would seem that we have it all. if we read Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Joshua, it's a series of historical records, all written in the third person. Notice, all written in the third person. These documents cover from the creation up through the children of Israel preparing to enter the land. And of course, Joshua tells the story of the conquest and the entrance into the land. We also have a version of the Ten Commandments. In Exodus, you have it. We have a record that the statutes, the judgments, the instructions, and the commandments have already been given, but we don't know who wrote these documents. We don't know. Meaning, the text does not declare who wrote these documents. Now, there are various theories that are put forth in regards to authorship, and this is called source criticism. Source criticism. By that we mean who is responsible, who's behind the sources. This is the point I wanted to get to today. That was an introduction. Early investigators of this problem, if you will, noted that Deuteronomy was different. So today's class is called Deuteronomy is Different. An initial look at the book of Deuteronomy suggested to these early investigators that it was a rehearsal of previously known material. So you have these stories told in any of the first 4 books, and most early investigators would look at Deuteronomy and they would say, this is the same material. We've already read this. I know these stories. Just as a little bit of background, I remember as a young teenager when I was in Christianity, and I wanted to start bringing my Bible to school with me. You know, that was going to be a bold move for me, you know. And so I remember bringing my pocket New Testament to school, and I remember I would read it, you know, from time to time. Not suggesting that my entire high school time in high school I was sitting around reading the Bible. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying, though, is when I was studying, I would read Matthew, and then when I got to Mark, I thought, I already know these stories. And when I got to Luke, I already knew these stories. They're called synoptics, right? They have the same material to a large degree. Not all. This isn't a class on that. But it's the same idea. When you read Deuteronomy, you will encounter stories and you'll think, I already know this. I've already read this story somewhere. What people don't do, though, is compare Deuteronomy's version with these other books. They just don't do it. And we should. Now, I also want to bring up that the name Deuteronomy, the English name Deuteronomy, comes to us not through the Hebrew. The Hebrew, the book of Deuteronomy, is called Devarim, the words. The book begins, Ele HaDevarim, these are the words of Moses. Now, but the name Deuteronomy comes from the Septuagint in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 18. Now, in Deuteronomy 17, 18, it talks about the king will write a copy of this Torah, and so that particular phrase, a copy, Mishneh HaTorah, was rendered into the Greek as Deuteronomos, second law, a copy of the law. So this backs up this prejudice that has long existed about the book of Deuteronomy that suggests that Deuteronomy is really just a rehearsal of previously covered material. We know all this. We've already read it. But a closer look at Deuteronomy, at Devarim, reveals that that's not what it is. Not even close. I'll give you a couple of examples. Deuteronomy contains 100 laws that we don't know before this point. 100, I'm using the word law. It could be a statute, a judgment, a rule. But 100 that we've not seen in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, or Numbers. It's not the same. That's pretty big. If I said, well, there are 5 laws that you hadn't seen before. 100? It's different. We also know that there is other new material that we've not encountered before that exist in Deuteronomy. We know, for instance, also that there are similar stories that reflect different language, different style, and different details, nomenclatures, words, phrases that we find in Deuteronomy that we don't find in the previous 4 books. And what this led scholars to say was someone different wrote Deuteronomy than wrote these other books. There's a style, totally different. Language, vocabulary, even details. Let me give you a few examples. Okay. An example would be the name applied to the holy mountain. This is an example. Now, if you read Exodus, you'll find 12 times that the holy mountain of Revelation is called Sinai. 12 times. If you go to Leviticus, you'll find 4 times Sinai. If you go to Numbers, you'll find 12 times Sinai. So think about this. You've got 28 references already to Sinai. Deuteronomy has Sinai 1 time. These are just observations. They'll make more sense as the evidence accumulates. The one reference to the holy mountain as Sinai in the book of Deuteronomy comes to us in Deuteronomy chapter 33, verse 1. It is a third-person portion of the book, right? Now, the rest of Deuteronomy, in every place where we have the first-person account, Sinai is never used. Just an observation. Horeb is what the holy mountain is called in Deuteronomy 9 times. Leviticus and Numbers never uses Horeb. Okay? Now I realize these are a lot of details. What about the 10 words? The 10 words, I'm not going to go into great detail because I taught 15 classes on the 10 words. How do you teach 15 classes on 10 words? You can go back and you can listen to that. There are some significant variants, but I will say this just as a point. If you look at the 10 words in Exodus chapter 20 and compare it side by side with Deuteronomy 5, these are the 10 so-called commandments. Words that we claim, when we read the biblical text, to be spoken by God on the day of assembly from Mount Sinai, Horeb. These 10 words, side by side, exhibit variations. In fact, in Exodus, if you look at the Hebrew, there are 172 words that make up the 10 words in Exodus 20. If you look at Deuteronomy, it's 189 words. Differences. Okay, so Deuteronomy is different. Here's another example. The 2 stone tablets, they're referred to many, many times in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers as the testimony, never called the testimony in Deuteronomy. We mention the 2 tablets. We talk about the 10 words. We talk about the covenant But never is the phrase ha'edut, the testimony. It's never used in Deuteronomy. Everywhere else it's used. If we read the story of the ark, which carries the testimonies, if we read the story of the building of the ark, if we read in Deuteronomy, the only ark we see is the one that Moses made. Moses is told, make an ark, Deuteronomy chapter 10, and Moses says, and I made an ark. If you read in Exodus chapter 25 and following through Leviticus and Numbers, we know that that ark that's spoken of is one that was made by Bezalel and Aholiab. Deuteronomy doesn't mention them at all. You say, well, maybe it doesn't mention it, but that didn't. I'm just saying these are differences between Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. How about the burden of leadership? I want you to go with me to the book of Exodus, chapter 18. Exodus 18. This is before the revelation at Sinai. Exodus 18. And beginning in verse 13. And by the way, we have Jethro, as we say, Jethro or Yitro in Hebrew. He's also known as Ruel in some text. But Moses' father-in-law is there for a visit, right? In verse 13, and it came to pass on the morrow that Moses set to judge the people, and the people stood by Moses from morning to evening. And when Moses' father-in-law saw all that he did for the people, he said, what's this thing that you do for the people? Why do you sit alone, and all the people stand by you from morning to evening? And Moses said to his father-in-law, because the people come to me to inquire of God. When they have a matter, they come to me, and I judge between one and another, and I do make them know the statutes of God and his TORAH. His instructions, if you will. And Moses' father-in-law said to him, the thing that you do is not good. You'll surely wear away, both you and this people that's with you, for this thing's too heavy for you. You're not able to perform it yourself alone. Listen to me now. I'm going to give you some counsel, and may God be with you. You be the link between the people and God, and you may bring the cases to God, and you shall teach them the ordinances and the Torah, plural, the instructions, and shall show them the way in which they must walk and the work that they must do. Moreover, you shall provide out of all the people able men such as fear God, men of truth, hating unjust gain, and place such over them to be rulers of thousands and rulers of hundreds, rulers of 50s, rulers of 10s, and let them judge all the people at all seasons. And it will be that every great matter that they shall bring to you, but every small matter they shall judge, it'll be easier for you, and they shall bear the burden with thee. If you do this thing, and God commands you so, then you shall be able to endure, and all this people shall go to their place in peace. It says Moses hearkened. So the story, according to Exodus 18, is that there's a great burden. The great burden is the burden of leadership. Moses is having to deal with all of this alone. And so Jethro, his father-in-law, gives him advice and says, here's what I recommend that you do in order to alleviate some of this burden. Comes from Jethro, right? Well, we have a similar story. This is before the revelation at Sinai. That doesn't happen until the next chapter. But go with me to Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 1 tells also a story about the burden of leadership and appointing other rulers over. Let's show you what Deuteronomy says. First person. Deuteronomy 1, beginning in verse 9. And I spoke to you at that time, saying, I am not able to bear you myself alone. Jehovah your God has multiplied you, and behold, you are this day like the stars of heaven for multitude. Jehovah, God of your fathers, make you 1,000 times so many more as you are, and bless you as he promised you. How can I myself alone bear your care and your burden and your strife? Take wise men and understanding and know among your tribes, and I will make them rulers over you. And you answered me and said, the thing which you have spoken is good for us to do. So I took chief of your tribes, wise men and known, and made them heads over you, captains over thousands, captain over hundreds, captain over fifties, captain over tens, and officers among your tribes, and so forth. Now, you might say, well, the two can go together. I'm just suggesting they're different accounts. Notice that the account in Deuteronomy comes after the revelation at Sinai, doesn't mention at all Ruel or Jethro. So it's a different account. It's a different story. Now, and again, there's no mention of Jethro. What about the spies? Everybody remembers the story of the spies, right? Now, you might remember the story as it's given in the book of Numbers, in Numbers chapter 13. All right? In Numbers chapter 13, go with me there, just to pick up a point. Numbers chapter 13, verse 1. And Jehovah spoke unto Moses, saying, you send men that they might spy out the land of Canaan, which I give to the children of Israel. Of every tribe of their fathers shall you send a man, every one a ruler among them. And the story continues. Here in the book of Numbers, chapter 13, the most famous version of the tribes, or the story of the spies, it's the one most people would go to, tells the story that Jehovah is the one whose idea it is to send the spies. Let's see what the account in Deuteronomy says. This is called horizontal study. It's comparing stories in one place with another, okay? And there's a reason for this, and it's not negative. It's not a negative enterprise. It's not to degrade. It's to bring up something significant. Go with me to Deuteronomy 1 and verse 22. Deuteronomy 1:22. And you came near to me, every one of you, and said, we will send men before us, and they shall search us out the land and bring us back word by what way we must go up and into what cities we shall come. And the saying pleased me well, and I took 12 men of you, one from a tribe, and so forth. So notice clearly that according to the book of Numbers, Jehovah tells Moses, choose these tribes, representatives of the tribes, and send them as spies. In Deuteronomy, it doesn't give that account. It says that the people come to Moses and say, we want to send spies. You see the difference? Okay. I'm not going to go into the Passover so much as I did that in a previous class, but just remember, if you recall that class I showed in Exodus 12:8 and 9, that the Passover was to be roasted in fire and lo bashal in Hebrew, not boiled, it's translated. Whereas in Deuteronomy 16, verse 5, it says that they are to bashal, to boil it. Different stories, different accounts, different books. Now, here's a key point that I want to get to today. In Deuteronomy 16, verse 6, it tells us that the Passover is not to be done any other place than the place that Jehovah would choose. The place that he will choose. Not just, you can't just do this anywhere. All right? This point, this additional stipulation that's noted only in Deuteronomy has long been noted as what is called centralization of the sacrificial cult. Centralized, it's only in Deuteronomy, and we know it by 34 different references, only in Deuteronomy. All right, so here they are, just kind of a high level. the place that he will choose. That phrase, the place he will choose, it's mentioned 19 times in Deuteronomy. It's only Deuteronomy. Then you have his name there, the place where his name is, 9 times. Only Deuteronomy. And then you have a phrase, his name dwells, 6 times. Only Deuteronomy. The focus on a singular place where all worship is to be performed, and the only place that's authorized for such performance is isolated to the book of Deuteronomy. Now, scholars viewed this as evidence that Deuteronomy is late. Let me explain. They noticed that only Deuteronomy talked about you can only do these sacrifices and festivals in a certain place, and that's got to be late. Now, why did they think that? Because they said it indicates that these rules came to pass once there was a place. You follow me? So if you're in the wilderness and you don't have a place that Jehovah has chosen, then you're not going to restrict these acts, these performances, these rituals, these sacrifices to a place that doesn't exist. But the scholars suggested once there was a place identified, which ultimately became Jerusalem, then they said, oh, and by the way, you can only do it here. So what they suggest, the scholars, is that this was written later, and this is a telltale sign. It's evidence. We got him. We got the forger. See, this is what they thought. They further pointed out that if this was such a big deal, then why don't the patriarchs know about it? Patriarchs are sacrificing all over the place. Noah built an altar. You have Abraham built an altar here. You work through all the patriarchal narratives. You get to the priest. You get to the prophets. You work through the text. You even get through the kings, priests, prophets. They're building altars all over the place. Why is that not condemned anywhere in the text? You see, this is what the scholars said. They said, if it were truly an ancient restriction, they would have got in trouble for it, and they never do. This is their idea. These were violations, they said, but they're late. Now, I suggest that perhaps they've gone too far, that these scholars have taken meager clues and gotten to far-reaching conclusions perhaps they didn't have to go to. Go with me to Exodus chapter 20. Exodus chapter 20. And verse 21. An altar of earth you shall make to me, and you shall sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen, in all places where I cause my name to be pronounced. I will come to you and I will bless thee. See, Exodus chapter 20, verse 21 seems to say that wherever the name is associated with, that's where this meeting will take place. So Exodus, it doesn't preclude a singular place being declared later, but it's saying that the name must be associated with that place in order for it to be a holy covenantal transaction. You follow? So what I would propose, Deuteronomy does not mention a name of a place. It's basically saying the place where God chooses, wherever that might be. Now, if you look, just to go through a couple of texts, go to Jeremiah 7. Jeremiah 7 and verse 12. It says this in Jeremiah 7, verse 12, "But go now to my place which was at Shiloh, where I set my name at the first, and see what I did to it for the wickedness of my people Israel." In other words, the first place God puts his name is not Jerusalem, it's at Shiloh. And for 369 years, the tabernacle stays at Shiloh. So that was the place at the time. Now look at 1 Kings chapter 8 and verse 16. 1 Kings 8 and 16. Now you'll remember the context of this, you should. Now notice it says in verse 16, "Since the day that I brought forth my people Israel out of Egypt, I chose no city out of all the tribes of Israel to build a house, that my name might be there. But I chose David to be over my people Israel." So the idea that Solomon is saying is that up until the dedication of the temple, there was no city that was chosen, right? Now, an interesting text is found in 2 Chronicles 6, verse 5. 2 Chronicles 6, 5. It's the story as told in Chronicles that I just read in 1 Kings 8. 2 Chronicles 6, verse 5. "Since the day that I brought my people out of the land of Egypt, I chose no city among all the tribes to build a house in, that my name might be there, nor did I choose any man to be ruler over my people Israel. But I have chosen Jerusalem, that my name might be there, and I have chosen David to be over my people Israel." Notice this one adds the phrase, "but I've chosen Jerusalem." So here's what we know. Clearly, Jerusalem, because of the place, becomes the place, but Deuteronomy doesn't mention a specific place. But scholars saw in these 34 references of centralized worship, they said, you know what? This to us looks like it indicates it was written late, after the place was already established. So different was Deuteronomy that investigators deemed it late and secondary. And since the earliest investigators, people have been prejudiced against Deuteronomy. And one of the reasons I've been going into Deuteronomy so deeply is because I want to redeem it from this secondary status that it's been relegated to, because I propose that Deuteronomy is not late and secondary, but within Deuteronomy is contained the authentic, original, call it you are Deuteronomy, this initial, the real deal. Now, the scholars would go forward and say the following things about Deuteronomy: that it's derivative from the other books. In other words, when it tells stories that we learn about in Exodus, Leviticus, or Numbers, and the details different, you know what the scholars say? Whoever wrote Deuteronomy wasn't careful. They didn't care about the details in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. They said they were sloppy. Whoever wrote this, they write it, it's late, it's secondary, and the scribe didn't care about the details. The scribe didn't, if you would have talked to the scribe of Deuteronomy, according to the scholars, and said, you know, you said in, the Torah tells us in Numbers 13 that God says send the spies, but you said it was the spies himself that came, and the scribe would say, don't bother me with details. I don't care. Well, I don't believe that. I don't think that's what's going on here. I think we have to pay attention to what's before us. Now, there was a scholar, a German scholar, by the name WML. These are his initials. I could give you his whole name. DeWitt. He's a German theologian, biblical scholar, and in the 19th century. So he's born in 1780. He dies in 1849. He comes up with one of the main theories about Deuteronomy that's still talked about to this day in all these academic circles. He says that the account of the scroll discovery, which we've discussed in previous classes, in 2 Kings 22 and 2 Chronicles 34, that in the reign of Josiah, when the scroll is discovered, he says it's evident from reading these texts that the scroll that was discovered, notice, I'm putting air quotes, is the book of Deuteronomy. He says that. But then he goes on to say this. He said it really wasn't a discovery of an ancient scroll. It wasn't a discovery at all. He says, this scholar, DeWitt says, that the whole story was concocted to advance Josiah's reform. In other words, Josiah wants to do a reform, and this is what the scholar DeWitt said. He said that Hilkiah or someone said, hey, look, I just found this scroll, ink still dripping on it. I just found this scroll, and it says that all the worship has to be done in Jerusalem, and he's advancing what we now know as Deuteronomy. So he says it's not an ancient scroll that was discovered. He went so far as to call Deuteronomy a pious fraud. Now, you might not know that a lot of scholars believe this about Deuteronomy, but they do. And he dates it to the 7th century BCE. In other words, it was written, that's the day it was discovered according to the biblical account in 622 BCE. He says that discovery is actually the publication date. Okay? And then another scholar in 1943 by the name of Martin Noth, another German scholar, would take things a little bit further. He accepted the late date for Deuteronomy. He said, yep, Deuteronomy was written in the 7th century. It's late. It's later than Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. But he noted that similar phrases, like if you begin in Deuteronomy, he noticed that there were phrases found in Deuteronomy that were also evident in the next 6 books. So you'd find a phrase in Deuteronomy, it's not in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, or Numbers, but it is found Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. And he found lots of them. And you know what he did with that? He said, I take what DeWitt says and I add the following. He says, not only did the scroll that we now have as Deuteronomy, the pious fraud, not only was it written in the 7th century BCE, but the same scribe that wrote it also wrote the next 6 books. So they're all late. You see what scholarship did. It said, we're going to build on it. We're going to push everything to the 7th century BCE or later. So at a minimum, he said either the same scribe or school of scribes wrote these documents, or the one who published, found Deuteronomy, also heavily edited the next 6 books. And this theory became known because what Noth does is he devised a hypothetical historian called the Deuteronomist. So some of you may have seen that phrase, the Deuteronomist. The Deuteronomist has been in some scholarly literature a reference for a singular scribe or for a school of scribes who wrote not only the book of Deuteronomy, or heavily edited it, but also the next 6 books. In other words, the hand of that scribe, the Deuteronomist, is evident throughout those books. And this was the way that Martin Noth accounted for the congruence between these documents. Now, I realize that today I'm delving into more of the academic than I normally do, but I'm doing this for a very important reason. I'm demonstrating that many of the academic thoughts that are out there are divided. Why did they come up with this? Like, for instance, the centralization of worship. This is very key. We have to understand, why does Deuteronomy talk about it and the other books not? I don't want to be timid about or shy away from the fact that we have variations between our sources. I want to address them. And this is the first way that you have to do is open it up. You got to look at it. You have to understand what's going on here. These 2 theories, a late date for Deuteronomy and a school of scribes, a theoretical, hypothetical historian called the Deuteronomist, most academics point to both of these anytime they talk about Deuteronomy. I'm doing something totally different. What I'm saying is that Deuteronomy is first. Now, if I said that to most scholars of the Hebrew Bible, they would go, you're out of your mind. We know it's late because we have these great works of Duet and Note. But see, I'm applying the Scriptures to the theory. I'm looking at Deuteronomy as the only book which contains within it a first-person position. It's presented from the perspective of the first person. That's not the case with Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, or Numbers. Only in Deuteronomy do we get this first person. As a believer in the scriptural records, I see evidence that suggests this alternative solution to the potential problems. We know that Moses wrote a scroll. We read about that. It says that Moses wrote a scroll, right? We've read through those. We've covered that. Now, we also know that Moses takes the scroll and he gives it after it's completed in Deuteronomy chapter 31. Remember, the Torah is not done yet. But he says when he finished writing his scroll to the very end, he rolls it up and he gives it to the Levites who carry the ark. In a previous class, I pointed out that these people are known as the Kohathites, a particular group of Levites. The Kohathites had a very particular job. They were in control of the most holy items, one of which was the scroll that Moses wrote. The Kohathites. The Kohath, the family of Kohath, is the same family that Moses and Aaron come from. They also were responsible for carrying the ark. I believe that this group, now it's not often that I say I believe. I usually say go here and let me show you. But my current evidence suggests to me that this group of Kohathites, and I will get into this more in next classes, are a logical group to produce other histories based upon recollections and records of the wilderness journeys and the patriarchal narratives and so forth. The Moses scroll. The Moses scroll, that little scroll written by the hand of Moses, contained exactly what these other works said it did. We have 7 references to what Moses wrote. As shown in previous classes, all 7 of those point to Deuteronomy. 7 references to what Moses wrote, all of which point to Deuteronomy. Known in our sources, the Moses scroll is known in our sources by several names. This scroll of the teaching, the scroll of Moses, and the Torah of Moses. Whenever we see any of those references, some 40 some odd references to any of those phrases, all of it points to content found in Deuteronomy, and many of those are exclusive to Deuteronomy. I believe, and more importantly, the textual evidence shows that the scroll discovered in 622 BCE by Hilkiah in the temple was the actual scroll written by Moses. It wasn't a production that Hilkiah or someone whipped up for the occasion of Josiah's reform. I don't believe it's late. I don't believe that, and I think that the evidence suggests otherwise. When this scroll was discovered, it would have been 8 centuries old. 8 centuries old. Remember, when we talk about the scroll of Moses, the content within Deuteronomy, it's first person. The others aren't. Some people may not have listened to the previous classes, so they might not know that. But if you look in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, it says, and the Lord spoke unto Moses and said, and that's third person. Whereas Deuteronomy contains this first person work. This first person scroll that was discovered by Hilkiah would have been 8 centuries old. Now, just for a marker, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947, think about this. We know that they date back, carbon dating, 2,200 years. 200 to 100 BCE. 2,200 years old. This would have been more than half, less than half that age. And some of these Dead Sea Scrolls are in pretty good shape. So it wasn't like this dilapidated, worn out. I mean, you roll it out and read it. It was a shorter work. It was written in the first person, containing only what Moses wrote. Our present Torah, the Pentateuch, the 5 books, contains within it material written by Moses, first person, supplemented by other histories, by material that I believe was written by these scribal circles, particularly those responsible for maintaining the records of the holy. Now, a lot of people speculate as to who these scribes were. There's no need to speculate, as you'll see in future classes. We know where they come from. The scroll of Moses was not lost this time, but it was preserved and discernible because of clues left by Kohathite scribes. Our study of the holy histories has only just begun. Now we can proceed, not today. Some of you are thinking, what do you mean now we can proceed? In future classes, we can proceed to study the 5 books that contain the holy histories. But for that, you have to wait not 1 week, but 2. Now, why is that? This coming Shabbat, I'm out. I'm on vacation, if I can call it that. My wife and 2 of my boys are going to take a long road trip from Louisiana to Colorado to visit my oldest son and his family. Many of you know Ty. So he's taken off from his duties at the hospital. He's an ER doctor, and he's booked this time in a year in advance. So we're going to have some family time next week, but I won't leave you with nothing. In fact, I think you'll be pretty satisfied with what we've come up with. The goal, should we be able to work out the technology, is that Dr. James Tabor will be teaching live next Saturday, same time, 10:30 Central Time, 11:30 Eastern, from his home or from Charlotte. And so stay tuned for details about that. So until then, until I can come back to you and resume this study, Shabbat Shalom, Shavua Tov, have a beautiful week, and don't denigrate the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is different, yes, but it's not late, it's not secondary, it's not simply a rehearsal of what has come before. It is, or represents, the content within it is actually the scroll that Moses wrote. Shabbat Shalom.